Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I am Manova Schoonover, Operations Specialist for Redwing Consulting, and I'll be hosting this event. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including, but not limited to, tribal comprehensive, responding to urban natives, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at HONOVI@red-wind.net. That's Hanovi at red-wind.net. You can also visit our website at red-wind.net for additional information on services we provide, upcoming events, and resources, such as handouts and guidebooks that you can download. As this states, this project is supported by grant number 15J OVW 21 GK 02197 STOP, awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication, program, exhibition are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. This webinar is part of our Tribal College Campus series. This event does have captioning, which you'll need to turn on manually from the menu. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box or the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, or you can click the hand icon. You'll all be muted, so if we see the hand, we can then unmute you so that you may ask your question verbally. If there are any tech issues, you can send a private message to me and we'll try to get it resolved. I will now turn it over to Emily and Tara.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm Tara Richards, and I'm here with my colleague and writing and research partner, Emily Wright. And we're really glad to be back doing another webinar for Redwind. So just a little bit about us before we get started. I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska-Omaha, and I do not identify as Indigenous, so I want to make sure to be transparent about that. My colleague, Dr. Emily Wright, is a former faculty here at UNO, but she is now a principal research associate at the Urban Institute. She's also an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation, and she and I have been writing and thinking on and speaking with and working with Indigenous folks in Nebraska and Arizona and New Mexico and beyond for several years now. And we're really excited to bring some of the experiences that we've had to you guys today. So we have been consultants for Redwind and with Redwind for a couple of years now on this project focused on developing and implementing holistic responses to sexual violence on tribal college and university campuses. And then we also have collaborated with Redwind on other projects focused on missing and murdered Indigenous persons in the United States. And so we're very grateful to the collaboration that we've had with Redwind over the years. Go ahead and advance the slide when you get a chance. So today, our primary objectives are to teach you guys a little bit about what a strengths and needs assessment is, talk about how to conduct a strengths and needs assessment specific to gender-based violence, and then how to use that information to improve prevention, intervention, and other responses to gender-based violence on your campuses. So we're really gonna talk about this work as if everybody in the room is working on or working with a tribal college or university. So if that's not you and you have questions that we don't cover, questions about stuff we don't cover from a different perspective, please just shoot that to us in the chat box and we'll be happy to talk about it more broadly. Okay, go ahead and advance the slide. Okay, so what is a campus climate assessment? Well, campus climate assessment is an assessment or a tool or a strategy that helps the campus, and in particular, their leaders and or administrators understand something about the campus climate, right? So here we're really focused on gender-based violence. So helping the campus community members understand things like student, faculty, and staff perceptions of gender-based violence on campus, their personal experience with gender-based violence on campus, their understanding or knowledge about areas of strengths and areas that need improvement regarding gender-based violence on campus. And then they can also be used to measure progress on initiatives or changes over time. So you could imagine giving a campus climate assessment at the beginning of a school year, asking students, faculty, and staff questions about their knowledge and their experience with gender-based violence, their understanding of resources on campus, of how to report, of supportive services, taking in that information, thinking about, okay, what are we doing really well? What do folks seem to know about, they seem to be using on campus? Where are gaps in services or gaps in knowledge? Creating some initiatives, perhaps training, new resources, and awareness campaigns about those resources. And then in a year or two, giving the survey again and seeing, okay, does it seem like campus community members, are receiving the resources they need? Do we seem to be closing the gaps that we identified in that first round of surveys? We'll talk more about campus climate assessments, but it doesn't have to be a survey. It's just traditionally they've been surveys. We're going to talk about why that may not work for a tribal college and university today. Okay, go ahead and advance the slide. Okay, so why are campus climate assessments important? Well, we know, generally speaking, that certain forms of crime and victimization are underreported, especially gender-based violence. So things like sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, stalking. These can be really hard to talk about for victim survivors, and there's a lot of reasons why they wouldn't want to report them to, for example, law enforcement. And so just looking at sort of those official sources of data, like reports to law enforcement or reports to other types of campus authorities, like your Title IX coordinator, for example, is usually not a very accurate report of gender-based violence on a campus because victim survivors just for a lot of different reasons don't report to these official data sources. So even a school's own, officially reported data can often be undercounts of gender-based violence. So if we know that our own, on our own campus, our official data is an undercount, then if we combine all schools together and try to look at a national picture of data, then we know we're just sort of compounding the problem over and over and over. So it can be really helpful for schools to collect their own school-specific data and do so in a way that collects more accurate information. And one way to do that is through these victimization surveys or these campus climate assessments, which ask people about their own experiences, but do it in a way that's anonymous and confidential and won't lead to something like it being, advanced to law enforcement or advanced to a Title IX coordinator so that it's officially reported, for example. Okay, go ahead and advance the slide. So how can campus climate survey data be useful specifically? Well, if you don't know the scope of the problem on your campus, then you really can't address it. So what we hope to do with campus climate assessments is to allow campuses or to assist campuses in really understanding the scope of the problem. Who is most impacted? Do you have certain community groups, for example, certain groups of students, for example, that are experiencing disproportionate rates of victimization. Do students understand, or first of all, does the campus know what kind of services it has, right? So, do you at the administrative or sort of the leadership level understand the breadth of services that are available? And then do students, faculty, and staff understand that those services are available, where to go, and what different supportive services are offered on campus? And, also, are there gaps in services, right? Are there things that students, faculty, or staff might benefit from that are just not available yet? So, first, campus climate assessments can help schools sort of identify the scope of the issue, and strengths and areas of weakness in regard to services. Based on that, it can provide a level of information to campuses about where to direct resources, right? So once you know the scope of the problem, once you know what you're doing really well in terms of services and where you could improve, then you can use those finite resources in a more informed way. So what we would like to see schools doing with campus climate assessment data is being informed in the ways that they're improving training and prevention, allocating resources to survivors, and closing those gaps in policies and procedures that will hopefully help prevent violence and victimization, and will also help improve the response to survivors when it does happen. Okay, go ahead and advance the slide. Okay, so why do we need a webinar specific to TCUs? Well, because we know that tribal colleges and universities are different than mainstream universities in a lot of ways. And while campus climate assessments are really proliferated at mainstream institutions, TCUs haven't gotten that same attention. And so we want to close that gap. We know from the data that exists that there are higher rates of violence and victimization among American Indian Alaska Native persons, both annually and then across the lifetime. And we know that victimization experiences are detrimental to student outcomes. So, if a student experiences sexual assault, if they're in a violent relationship, they're more likely to leave school, to drop out, to disengage from their classes, to have worse academic outcomes in terms of grades and sort of campus engagement, which are all things that we don't want as educators and researchers doing work on college campuses, right? We want to find ways to retain students and support their success. We also know that students at tribal colleges and universities are predominantly American Indian Alaska Native folks, and that there's significant historical and ongoing trauma in Indigenous communities. So we want to take that into consideration when we're thinking about even how to craft a campus climate assessment. What types of victimization experiences might we be thinking about? So what really brought us to this webinar is that we, Dr. Wright and I, along with one of our graduate students, are helping a TCU actually develop a campus climate assessment that is, that they're developing. So developed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And we're really trying to create a measure that captures some of these victimization experiences that are specific to American Indian Alaska Native folks. So, for example, having histories of family members who were forced to attend government-run boarding schools, having loved ones or community members who have gone missing. These are victimization experiences that are quite specific to the American Indian Alaska Native lived experience. So really thinking about those types of experiences and how they might be captured in a campus climate assessment to really understand what that campus community is experiencing. We also, understand that there might be some barriers in terms of sort of cultural values or lived experiences in the community, in perhaps not being believed, not having a holistic response when they do experience victimization. So, we know that American Indian, Alaska Native families experience disproportionate rates of having children removed into the foster care system. So if you have someone who, if they experienced violence in their family, but telling only results in more trauma to their family, then disclosing becomes a really, really risky behavior. So we also understand that there again are some connections between this historical trauma and likelihood of reporting within American Indian, Alaska Native communities. So knowing all of these things, we really, believe that having these campus climate assessments that are created for these communities are important to understanding the scope of the problem and really empowering tribal colleges and universities to serve their students in a way that is safe and supports their well-being, again, in a culturally centered way. Okay, if you want to advance the slide. So what are strengths and needs assessments? So they're really the first part of a campus climate assessment. So this is really where you're trying to get the landscape of the university's sort of policies, procedures, resources, things that would be strengths, right? And really identify where there are gaps in those things that would constitute, an area of need or an area of improvement. So you really want to know what exists, what doesn't exist, what do we need, what do we have, right? So in regard to gender-based violence, these could be things like access to victim services, both on campus and then in the community, right? So referrals off campus. Policies for reporting and responding to victimization experiences. So are there written policies about how students, faculty, staff might report, who they report to, what happens after they report, and then what is this holistic response? Are partnerships needed, right? It's hard for a campus community to serve all of students, all the varied needs that students have, and so there may be community partners that are needed. So developing those partnerships so that if a student or faculty or staff needs that service, then someone on campus can sort of do this warm handoff so that again, that your campus community member is getting the help that they need. And that you can, again, let that campus community member know, we have this partnership in place. I know what's going to happen here. This is what you're going to experience when you go see this service provider. You can trust them, right? And then also making sure that there's trainings in place. So trainings that meet the federal requirements under the Title IX guidance and Campus Save Act guidance, but also, training that doesn't just meet the requirements, but, are really going to empower campus community members to identify gender-based violence when it happens, and seek out the resources or the reporting mechanisms that they want and need. This is also going to produce data for you, right? So you can identify again what policies, trainings, partnerships, services are in place, and then what is needed. Okay, you can advance the slide. Okay, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Wright.
Why, thank you so much. So, as Tara said, there is a gap, I think, in nationally speaking, in terms of what we call mainstream campuses and universities do, and what tribal colleges and universities can do. And we also see that in the use of strengths and needs assessment, assessment tools. And so we're really we're approaching this problem with an eye toward cultural sensitivity, right? We don't want to just take a strengths and needs assessment that's already been done or completed or conducted with mainstream universities and apply it simply to TCUs. So we want to think about how are TCUs different, perhaps, than mainstream campuses, and what does that mean for research that you might be doing with regard to strength and needs assessment or campus climate assessments at TCUs in particular. So yes, they are different, the TCUs and the mainstream universities. And so you want to think about these differences before you move forward in conducting strengths and needs assessments or attempting to create something like a campus climate assessment at TCUs in particular. Now, the mission of TCUs tends to be different than what you see at mainstream universities. At TCUs, the mission is really to be a pillar for preserving traditional and cultural ways. So, as such, the responses and prevention of something like gender-based violence either may not be as prevalent or it may look a lot different because of cultural differences. And we have to remember in this regard that violence is really not an indigenous value. So it wasn't, something that keeps you at its core, at the mission at its core to be relevant for the tradition of the tribe might not include violence because violence is not an indigenous value. So, and then you've got different student populations as well as settings. So in many TCUs might be attached to or very close to a tribal reservation. Those tend to be more in rural areas than you see mainstream colleges and universities. This is actually a pretty big deal in terms of services for the university, the students at the university, the faculty, and the staff at the university, especially when we talk about victim services, because access to victim services could be even more limited when you talk about serving a rural area. Again, you want the responses, the responses to gender-based violence and victim services should reflect and integrate those traditional values and practices of the tribe. And so again, you're going to see differences in that way from between TCUs and the mainstream campuses. And then of course, we know that the majority of tribal colleges and universities are smaller and they have a lot, they're much more limited resources at tribal colleges and universities than you see at mainstream universities. All of these things are going to trickle down and impact perhaps what you find with the strengths and needs assessment, but I would say also how you approach it in the first place when you're going to do it with a tribal college or a university. So let's go to the next slide if you're okay with that. Oh, those did not show up. I am sorry. I thought we had changed the font on those. Well, I'll go through them. Don't worry. So, what might be different about a strengths and needs assessment at TCUs than what you might find at a mainstream university? First, you're probably going to see differences, different levels of resources. So you might ask things on your strength and need assessment at a TCU. You might ask, are there services that are provided on campus or are they off campus? Again, because of rurality, number one, the location of the TCU, And we also see some jurisdictional complications come up, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you might actually see more off-campus services being offered than you would see at a mainstream university. And then you want to also look at the available services that they have, and you want to see if those are culturally informed or relevant to the tribe's traditional ways. Now, we do see jurisdictional complications come up, not only with TCUs, but in Indian country in general. And so one thing we're sort of finding is we like to ask the tribal college or university, do you have trusted law enforcement officers in your community? Now, they could be tribal or they could be non-tribal, but do you have trusted officers that students or faculty or staff could go to if they want to report an assault? Because that's quite an important piece of responding to violence and victimization, is first and foremost getting it reported to the right place. And jurisdictional complications can absolutely influence how likely and to whom crimes are reported. And then you'll see differences at TCUs with regard to cultural values than you would at mainstream campuses. And one of these things that may be particularly important to think about is that there may be cultural values about the meaning of certain types of victimization, the realities around it, and especially when it comes to disclosure of victimization and the response to victimization. So cultural values may actually impact how likely somebody is to report something that has happened, and they may also impact what is done in the aftermath. So for instance, we find that especially among Native community members, they may have some negative experiences with law enforcement officers or agencies or social service agencies that actually deters them from reporting in the future. So these are things to definitely keep in mind when you are assessing and trying to understand the response to victimization at a tribal college or university. If you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Now, what would you do to get ready to conduct a strengths and needs assessment at a tribal college or university? So this is some of the stuff that I absolutely love to think about. And I always start with, especially when you're doing work with tribal community members, is to get them involved. Let the community that you're working with know what you're doing. Get the leadership involved at the tribal college or university involved. You absolutely want to engage in this research to help the community and sort of in collaboration with the tribe and the tribal members. You are not coming in to do research on them, and I think, or to them. This is just a really good, I would say, best practice when it comes to conducting research with tribal community members. You want them to know about it. You want them to understand it, and you want to be clear about how your research may be beneficial and helpful to the community. You also want to be clear about what you can't, but also can't do with assessments. So a strength and needs assessment's really just going to identify areas of, strengths for your TCU. It's also going to identify areas that maybe need a little bit more improvement, a little more attention, resources, a little more love. It's not going to change the world, so to speak, but it might put you one step further in addressing some, needed or open gaps in services that are provided at the TCU. You will need buy-in from the community, the college, university, or college officials, leadership, administration, and eventually student staff and faculty. So the administrators are going to have to give you access to or some understanding of some of the documents around policies, procedures, and services that you have or that they have at the university. So you're going to be in contact with them. You want them to know what you're doing, know why you're doing it, and trust you. And then eventually you're going to want to hear from students, faculty, staff about, for instance, their perceptions of services, whether they've accessed services, whether they know about them, and things like that. So you'll be engaging with all of these different groups, and you want them to be aware of what you're doing. And you also want them to understand how the findings can be used, the findings from the strengths and needs assessment. So, for instance, the one TCU that we're working with, we talked to them about, this isn't going to change things overnight, but we're going to help you identify some areas that you can improve upon in terms of, and provide better prevention or response to gender-based violence at the university. And we're going to show you some areas where you're doing a pretty good job, like kudos to you, but these aren't areas of, significant need. And eventually that may change, or that may lead to changes in policies or the addition of new or different services, as well as training opportunities. Next slide, please. So a strengths and needs assessment is going to rely a lot on policy and other document review. So you're going to want to access information, their policies or other documentation around the services that they have, the policies that they have on the books, the partnerships they have, and this might be especially true at tribal colleges and universities, again, because of the rural location of the TCU and the fact that sometimes they have to rely on outside partners to provide services. And you're going to want to look at training as well, mandatory and I would maybe not so much mandatory, but available training for on different topics and regarding the responses to victimization when it occurs. So within these documents that you get access to, you're going to want to look at what is actually available at the campus. What kind of programs are available, what kind of trainings are available, what policies do they have on the books, things like that. And then where do the strengths lie? Because there's bound to be areas that the university, just like any other university, by the way, mainstream universities have lots and lots of gaps in services as well, but they also do some really good things as well. So where do the strengths lie? And then you'll also see where some of the deficits are. You will also want to know about access to services. And this is probably where you go in and ask leadership, staff, faculty, and students. So there's a difference between something being available on the web, on your website, maybe on your Canvas, or sort of remote learning software platform, whatever, and actually being utilized or accessed, right? And there is usually a big gap between those two things, again, at both TCUs and at mainstream campuses. Because if those services are not known by your users, your students, faculty, staff, whatever, they're not going to be used by them or accessed by them. So you want to understand levels of access to services as well. You also want to identify what is not even available, what's not there. These are the gaps that you're going to identify. And then while you're getting a sense of what the gaps are, this is also the time to start thinking about, well, how do you address these gaps? So for instance, you might have remote, you may have a TCU that offers both in-person and remote courses. Well, you may have in-person counseling that might be used by your students who are primarily on campus or around campus. But what about your students who are remote only, and maybe they are a state away or 2 states away and can't access the in-person services? So what's actually needed to address that gap in services? Do you offer something remote, some sort of counseling remotely? If so, what are the confidentiality issues around that? Do you have to think about new partnerships, perhaps, if you have branch campuses that aren't being served or don't have as many service options as your mainstream campus? Do you need to identify some new partnerships with, say, victim service personnel or advocacy agencies in those or around those branch campuses? Is this just a training issue? Did you have someone who provided a certain service or even a certain training to your faculty or to your staff who left or who retired, and now that service is just not available because they moved on? What is needed to address those gaps? So there's some fun ways to think about addressing some of the gaps in the services that exist there at the TCUs. And sometimes you have to be pretty innovative and think out of the box to come up with these ideas. Next slide, please. So this is a very rudimentary draft of something that we've been working on with our project with a TCU. And it's basically just identifying what services they have. And this draft, this is only 1 page of a multi-page document. Do they have an existing policy on it, for instance, on domestic violence? If they do, where's it found? Well, in this case, they find it in the student catalog. Well, that's good to know. Now, do they have existing MOUs that need, that might have to be executed in order to have a partnership with, let's say, an outside advocacy agency, so they can refer perhaps victims of domestic violence to that advocacy agency? Or are they just providing information via some sort of webinar? Do they have a training that's available online? Things like that. And then, to whom does this policy apply? Is it just for students, faculty, or staff, or can it be reached by all of these folks? We took away all the gaps in services for this presentation, but the gap in services is where you're starting to identify what needs to be done so that more people get access to this service, so nobody's slipping through the cracks. And again, you might think of both in-person and remote options. And then we provide a list of recommendations for how to address that particular gap in service. Next slide. Along with this, we want to know again about the people who you're serving. Who are your stakeholders? Students, faculty, and staff typically. Do they know about these services? So on page 1, we've got a list of available or unavailable services. And then the next part of that is we have to understand if they are, if they even know that these things are out there. I know for my purposes, if it is not staring at me in the face on the homepage of my, of the Urban Institute's webpage, and I have to dig around to find it, I am much less likely to read it or to know that it exists than if it's not emailed out to me or texted to me or put on that front page of the webpage. So this is where you would be able to ask your stakeholders, your students and your faculty and your staff, do you know about these services? Have you ever used any of these services? Yes or no? And then get a sense of, we haven't filled any of these out, but get a sense from them about why don't you know about these services? What do you think the barriers are? And then you want to track barriers to both knowing about these services, but also barriers to accessing them or using them. So you might get somebody who says, well, all of this material is online and I don't have reliable internet service, so I can only access these if I'm on campus, but I can't access them at home. And I'm too busy while I'm on campus to look into these. So there is a barrier to, they know about it, but they're unable to use it or access it. Okay, next slide, please. And then turning to how are you going to use this information? Again, the information that you get from a strengths and needs assessment is going to help you identify what are your most important services and their gaps that need to be addressed, number one. And so again, when we're talking about TCUs in particular, these tend to be smaller. They tend to have fewer resources than mainstream universities. And so it's really going to be important to be focused on what are those most essential services that need to be provided, and what are the most essential sort of responses that need to be available, because you've got limited resources, especially when compared to the mainstream colleges and universities. This will help you understand who doesn't have access to services, who's left out, so you can hopefully extend your services to them or get them access in some way. It's going to help you understand how to expand your access to services. And hopefully, once you expand access, you can also expand the number of those who can use those services. So you can remove barriers. You got to identify the barriers first before you can remove them. It might just be what you find is it might be an issue of you need to raise awareness for people to use these services or tools that you have, rather than having to make them, from scratch, essentially. Or again, it could be that you need to just train up some more people to provide these services. And these are people who would easily fill these roles, and then therefore a barrier would be reduced, so to speak. Next slide, please. This is the last one. So in the end, what are we suggesting, that you do if you want to use strengths and needs assessments, especially when it comes to tribal colleges and universities? So first, we suggest that you find a research partner with professional or lived experience working with indigenous and native communities. We have another project that we have going where we have sort of a local tribal member who is part of the research team, and they're great to work with. They are able to really give us insider knowledge about the tribe and what certain things might mean, or how best to navigate an issue or whatnot. So we really think that these are great partnerships to use in research. And we also think that it just helps both parties understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And really it forges great collaboration, and usually ends up being sort of, you have a friend in the end. You should design your research to be both feasible and useful to the TCU. If the TCU does not have the capacity to address, a ton of gaps in services, you need to understand that and help them identify only the most relevant, the most essential gaps in services that need to be addressed. Don't overwhelm them with things that their budget, their staffing, and things like that just cannot hold or handle. So design your research is going to be useful and not overwhelming or too much. You want to consider the various types of data that you will be asking your tribes to, and your TCU to basically give you access to. And that's, again, those policies and documentation, usually from the TCU side. And then you're going to maybe ask questions of students, faculty, and staff to get their perceptions and or their feedback. And so just know that these are pieces of the research puzzle, so to speak. And then again, you want to provide the findings and the results that you uncover in your research really should be actionable for the TCU. The last thing we want to do is say, go out and do a bunch of research that gets put on a shelf and doesn't get used. You want your research to provide actionable, real life and doable activities and recommendations for the TCU. So next slide, please. That is all we've got. And we can open it up for questions for a few minutes if anybody has them. If not, you do have our emails. And you are more than welcome to reach out to us or go through Redwind to reach out to us for any additional questions or thoughts.
Once again, if you do have any questions, you can put them into the chat or the Q&A.
And we want to thank everyone for their time today. It's raining outside for me, so I was not going to be outside playing anyway, but you might have had the opportunity, but yet you chose to listen to us, and we do appreciate it.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions, so we will wrap up. Thank you both for presenting today. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto Redwind's YouTube channel within the next few days. You can also find previous recordings there. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenters, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and we all hope to see you at the next webinar.